And welcome back to the Five Rings podcast. It's with great pleasure that we receive today Evan Dunfee, the Canadian record holder for the 20 kilometers, world record attendee, all around great athlete, but more important right now, investigator as well, who his story got an Associated Press, The Guardian as well, a big story out of Russia. First of all, Evan, how you doing this morning?
Oh, great. Thanks. Thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure, seriously. There's a big story that you wrote a couple last week about what's going on in Russia, and I'll let you just explain the gist of it to our listener and to set the story in context.
Yeah, for sure. Well, so as a race walker, I tend to follow all the race walking news that I can. And a couple weeks ago, some photos were posted on a Russian sort of social media website that featured photos from a race in December. And it was pretty peculiar that these photos seemed to picture a couple of athletes who are currently serving doping bans, which is a lot of violation. While you're competing, you can't, or while you're serving a doping ban, you can't be competing in any manner, even if it's a local competition. So this first caught the eye of a few people. It was posted on a couple of race walking specific websites and stuff, and just sort of figured that more needed to be done about this, that we needed to make a bit more noise because the current state of Russian with all the doping that's going on and the investigations into the sport in general. Just thought that this needed to get out there a little bit more. So we started looking a little bit more into it. And as we were doing this, the Russians actually came out and tried to claim that these photos were from 2012, that they weren't from a race in 2014. So we sort of ran with that and quickly found out that, well, no, this is impossible. They were wearing shoes that weren't available in 2012. There was a number of inconsistencies that lent to the fact that there was no way it could have been from 2012.
A lot of anachronism in the pictures,
yeah. Yeah, and then these new photos appeared that they said, well, no, like these are the photos from 2014, and they featured just the athletes that weren't on doping bans, which was convenient. But there was, again, a huge number of inconsistencies with these photos, and it looks like these have been staged. These were staged 2 weeks later to fit their narrative of these athletes not competing. So it's been sort of wrote a blog post about that, outlining sort of what had happened and how they had broken a lot of rules and stuff and how they were trying to cover it up. And it gained, as you said, it gained a little bit of press and got out in the Guardian, and I think Fox Sports ran a story on it as well. And I think that put a little bit of pressure. The IAAF started investigating, and the first big thing we had come through was a couple days ago. The IAAF and Viktor Chegin, the president of the Russian Athletics Federation, announced that, in fact, 3 athletes had been competing that weren't allowed to be competing. And one of these athletes was Sergei Bakulin, who was the world champion in 2011 in the 50K walk. And the interesting thing about this was that this is the first time it's ever been announced that he's been serving a doping ban.
Okay, that was kind of like a surprise.
Yeah, so someone's been keeping this.
Yeah, they just hit him for like 2 years, like, oh no, he's not serving a ban, but unofficially he was.
Yeah, so they come out and said he's been banned since December of 2012, and it's a biopassport ban. So it has to do with blood doping and tracing his values over time and
level of testosterone.
They're saying that and it's part of a ongoing investigation. But 2 years is a little ridiculous, and so it was. And the other interesting thing to look at that case was that 2 of his teammates, who are currently serving lifetime bans, were have their results stripped back to February of 2011, which is from a race in Russia that they did that Bakulin also participated in. So you can imagine that they also have a blood value for him from that point. So there's some motivation on the Russian side, at least, to want to keep this quiet, because if his ban was to get backdated to that point, he'd lose his world championship gold medal.
Yeah.
So don't know if that's the case, but there's some good motivation there for wanting to keep this secret. And this, to announce that he's been banned since 2012 is that 2 years. It seems a little ridiculous for an investigation to keep going of this nature.
if we're talking about the Lashmanova case a little bit more specifically, and the fact that she joined Viktor Chegin's camp in Russia and in the Saransk Race Walk Training Center in the state of Mordovia, it seems like it's a state-sponsored training center where, I don't know, allegedly almost anything goes. Just to let us know, talk about a bit more about Viktor Chegin and Lashmanova specifically.
Yeah, of course. So Viktor Chegin is the sort of the national race walking coach there, and it should be mentioned that in the state of Mordovia, race walking is their state sport. It's huge there.
It's probably where it's the biggest in the entire world.
Yes, yes. And this Saransk Training Center opened up in 1994, and they've produced a number of world champions, Olympic champions, more than any other training group and country in the world, probably. And the only problem is that Viktor Chegin, under his tutelage, has had, I think the number's up to 23 now, athletes.
Wow.
Serve doping bans.
That's not a coincidence.
No, and these are all athletes that trained out of this center in Saransk. And on top of that, the Saransk Center receives in excess of $2 million in funding, some of which is government funding.
Compared to the other country in the world in race walk, that's tenfold, if not more, than anywhere else in the world.
Yeah, it's infinitely more than most other places get.
And I think that's one of the reasons why this story is harder to get it out fully, is because race walk is not as glorified as a sprint is. Even though if you're talking about a sport performance, it's mind-boggling to me when talking about the 20K and the 50K. And it's really similar in a way, especially with tactics, the way cycling can be ran. Me as a big cycling fan, I hated to always bring it back to the reference of cycling, but for me, and with the doping, it's easier for the listener to understand and to relate to it in a way. But it's really mind-boggling to me that it takes this much for... Because now we're talking about 23 athletes from the same place. It's organized. It's almost... Yes, we have to say it's allegedly organized, but there's almost no other way that can happen.
Yeah, exactly. And you're right. It hasn't got as much attention that it should have had. It should have, because of the fact that it's race walking. But I mean, this center can be looked at as a microcosm for the entire what's going on in the entire Russian Federation. I mean,
True.
This is the most successful program within Russian athletics, and that shouldn't be taken lightly. The comparison I tried to draw for some people on Let's Run, the famous running forum, was that take the Nike Oregon project, which all runners know about, the Alberta Salazar coached program in Oregon that's producing some world champions, Mo Farah and Galen Rupp and stuff. Now imagine that Salazar now had 23 athletes that had failed doping tests, was still allowed to coach. And on top of that, the Nike Oregon project, say their funding wasn't coming from Nike, say it was coming from the U.S. Olympic Committee. That's what you have here, and I don't know why people aren't making a big deal about that. But
because in all fairness, on a different scale, is exactly the same what happened in the 90s with the U.S. Postal Team. That was with government funds that happened in the state too. And it really brought that to mind, having followed that for many, many years and wrote articles about it. I was really seeing parallels left and right.
Exactly, yeah. And in this case, with Lashmanova, so I guess it should also be mentioned that Lashmanova is the world champion, Olympic champion, and world record holder, which, again, should make it a little bit more high profile.
And should really raise questions about all the results they had. And one thing that was really interesting to me continuing to see, it's not just the hitting of the cover-up is all that. Is their levels with the biological passport too has been off for many, many years. Weird things happening in the last decade from that center, since you mentioned it. It's surprisingly that they just keep that going. It
is. Well, I don't want to say it's surprising, because from everything I've seen now, in their attempts to cover it up and just digging a little deeper into the center, it's pretty apparent that these doping bans in Russia don't have any impact. They don't mean anything to the athletes. They're still viewed as champions. They're clearly still training with the training center, even though they're on their ban.
It
It's
doesn't
just
taint the aura like it does in North America.
exactly. And even on the Sarant's website's homepage, where their little about me section, they list some of the athletes that have been training with them, and they list Skirgin, who was originally was the world champion in 1999, but had that result taken away because of a doping ban. And on the website, they list him. They list him as being the world champion in 1999. So clearly, that it's not as frowned upon as it is in North America. It's sort of like, oh, well, you got caught this time. You'll come back and try again.
It's more a society that's trying to find a loophole not to get caught instead of changing the mindset towards sports performance.
Yeah, and it seems to be pretty endemic, and I think the only way to put a stop to this is to hand down bigger sanctions to, in this case, starting with the Sarant's Center. Viktor Chegin should definitely be given a long ban, and anyone involved in this cover-up should be given a ban, because that's just where you have to start. And if any of these allegations from the German documentary, the ARD documentary, looking at systematic doping in Russia as a whole, if any of those can be proven, it's well within the IAAF's right to sanction the entire Russian Athletics Federation. And I think that's where we're going to have to go if this is ever going to stop.
Unfortunately, my co-host couldn't be here today, but he sent me a question, and it's a talking point we had a lot of time on this show about old world records from early 80s, early 90s even, when there was systemic doping going on in many different countries in the Eastern Bloc and all that. Especially in race walk, there's 16 men's outdoor records from the 90s and 2 from the 80s, and on the women's side, it's 8 from the 90s and an absurd 12 from the 80s, and the 800 meter is from 1983. Do you think that those records have to be tainted, and will be able to achieve those performances clean?
Yeah, some of those records are clearly tainted, especially if you look on the women's side with Flojo and the sprints, and you got the Chinese middle distance athletes from the early 90s that were part of a pretty big doping ring there, that just were lucky enough never to be caught, because at that time getting testers into China was pretty much an impossibility. And then you have the East German throwers and stuff like that. So it's pretty hard to look at those records and give them any sort of credibility. But at the same time,
do you have to, as an athlete, sorry to interrupt you, but as an athlete yourself, do you have to, are the records your end goal, or are the performances against your peers today on the same era are more your goal and your achievement you strive for?
I think that has to be more what you look at, and I can really only speak for me personally, but at the end of the day, I'd rather have an Olympic medal than a world record, and I think a lot of people out there feel the same way. The world record is icing on the cake sometimes if you can get it, but it shouldn't be something that athletes are striving towards unless they've separated themselves from the rest of the world. If you look at people like Usain Bolt, who's he had nothing less to compete against except for those records. In rare cases like that, I think you start setting your sights on the records. But other than that, you focus on being the best of your generation first.
To close the negative chapter of this part of the interview, what should we do going forward as the IAAF Federation, or just Russia Federation itself, if it wants to start policing itself the right way? What should we do going forward?
It's hard for me to say what's going to happen with the IAAF and with Russia and with the Russian Anti-Doping Association, because there's so many moving parts right now that I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I know half of what's going on. But I think one thing that needs to be done now is that the athletes themselves need to start standing up for clean sport. I know there's some Robert Harding, the German world champion and Olympic champion in discus. He's starting to stand up and have his voice heard, which is a pretty loud voice, against these actions. And I think we need more people to follow suit to really start putting the pressure on these federations to actually do something. All the stuff in Russia going on, especially for race walks, and yet they've been awarded the World Walking Championships in 2016 and 2018. And, that's unacceptable.
Let me guess, it's going to be in Saransk.
It's actually in Cheboksary, which they have a rival training center there, which is a little bit funny. But there's absolutely no way that these events should be allowed to be given to Russia in the current state of things. And I think that's just lack of pressure on the IAAF to really take this seriously.
All right. To end this interview and to talk a bit more about the positive side of thing and give people hope about sport is still nice and very important to everyone and can be a catalyst for good things in society. Can you tell us about your upcoming season, Evan, heading into Toronto and into Rio?
Yeah, so this is 2015 will be an exciting year for me. In 2014, I was lucky enough to have a pretty good year and set a pretty large personal best and broke the Canadian record.
20 kilometers?
Walking 20K in just over an hour and 20 minutes, which is
impressive.
4-minute kilometers. So this year, looking to do much of the same. Got a bunch of international races early in the year, and then Pan Am Games in Toronto will really be the big one, hoping to get on the podium there. And
we'll be there, by the way. Me and Dwayne will be there to support you.
that'll be wonderful. The race walk will be a great event. It'll be one of the few free events, so everyone can come out and take part in the Pan Am Games and come out and watch the race walks and the marathons and see some of Canada's top athletes. So that'll be really exciting. And
I'm a big fan of strategy in a race walk, especially because it does correlate with cycling a lot, and I can understand it. How would you describe yourself as a race walker, and what do you prefer to do? What's your favorite tactic? I don't want you to give away any secret, but what do you prefer to do on the course?
It's more about, for me, it's a big thing is knowing what I'm capable of and just having confidence in my game plan. So our World Walking Cup in last year in May, where I broke the Canadian record, it was one of those races where the race went out a lot faster than I expected, and I was feeling good, but I just kept telling myself, hold back, hang back, like stick to your game plan, and
they'll outpace himself, and they'll gas out, and you'll catch up, and you'll be able to go.
So I went through 10K. I think I was back in 35th or 36th position, something like that, and just kept sticking to my guns and being confident, knowing that I could come back to them. And I think by 15K, I'd moved up to 16th place, and by 20K, I was in 11th place. So that worked for me then, but now it's you have to take, the strategy has to be different every time you race. You have to know who you're racing and what your goal is. If your goal is for a fast time, you're going to race differently than if your goal is to place well.
Let our listener know where they can reach you, where they can send you support, encouragement heading into your season, where they can listen, reach you.
Yeah, so I'm pretty much everywhere. On Twitter and Facebook, just search for Evan Dunfee. I got a new website out where I've been doing this blogging for the Russian stuff, as well as having a personal blog and stuff about just about my story and stuff like that. And that's dunfeewalks.weebly.com.
And all the links will be available on the description of this show as well.
Yeah, perfect. I'm too cheap to upgrade to the expensive account where I can get rid of that. I can get my own domain name, but that works for me for now. So, yeah, those are the best places if anyone is interested in following along.
Evan Dunfee, thank you very much for taking the time to talking to us today. Continue your battle against, I was going to say corruption, but yeah, it is corruption, against shady things going on behind the curtains. It's 2015. Privacy is almost non-existent, and I think it should apply, especially in the world of sports. Transparency is the key going forward.
Yeah, definitely.